quiet street, a polished mansion, and a man who believed his world was intact, until one unexpected moment shattered the silence and forced him to see what had been hidden all along. He thought success meant safety, thought absence could be repaired with wealth, but the faint cry of a child exposed a truth sharper than any betrayal in business. What followed was not just a family dispute, but a reckoning that peeled away every mask and revealed how fragile love becomes when trust is misplaced. If you want to follow this story as it unfolds, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you think is really waiting behind the door. And also share where you are watching from. Jonathan Miller had lived most of his recent years moving from one business meeting to the next, caught up in the endless pursuit of wealth and expansion. He was known as a man who could close the toughest deals, who could turn a crumbling building into a gold mine with just a signature. He owned office towers in New York, luxury condos in Miami, and vacation estates scattered across the country. He wore tailored suits cut to perfection and Italian shoes that gleamed under boardroom lights. His Rolex ticked with mechanical precision, and people often said Jonathan Miller was the picture of American success. But success carried shadows. Beneath the polished exterior was a man who carried unbearable guilt. 8 months earlier, his wife Angela had died giving birth to their son Noah. Angela was a woman of strength and warmth, a black woman whose laugh could light up any room, whose tenderness had made their house into a home. Her absence left a cavern Jonathan tried to fill with work, pretending numbers and contracts could distract him from grief. But while he buried himself in skyscrapers and investments, his children were left behind. Grace, their 6-year-old daughter, had inherited Angela's curls and warm brown eyes. She was bright, sensitive, and gentle, but Jonathan had rarely taken the time to notice since Angela's passing. Noah, the infant, had been born into sorrow. Jonathan had barely held him, afraid that touching the child would break open the grief he had tried to bury. And so the children had been left in the care of Vanessa, Jonathan's second wife, a white woman with flawless features and the polished manners of someone who knew how to move in wealthy circles. Vanessa had once been Angela's friend, always smiling sweetly, always offering help. To Jonathan, she had seemed like salvation, someone who could keep the household together, someone who could be a motherly figure for the children. But what Jonathan didn't know was that beneath the polished exterior, Vanessa's heart was filled with bitterness and resentment. Angela's memory lingered in every corner of the house, and the children with their biracial features were constant reminders that she could never replace her. On that late evening, Jonathan had finished reviewing contracts in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park. He signed the final document with his gold-plated pen, leaned back in his leather chair, and for the first time in weeks, thought not of profit margins, but of Grace and Noah. A sudden impulse struck him. He wanted to go home early, to arrive without warning, to surprise them. Perhaps Grace would run to him. Perhaps Noah would smile when he saw his father's face. For the first time in months, Jonathan felt the faint stirrings of fatherhood. He grabbed his coat, ignored his secretary's questions, and took the elevator down. The sleek black car whisked him from Manhattan to the quiet suburbs where his mansion stood behind wrought iron gates. The house was grand, every line of its design shouting wealth. Chandeliers sparkled in the entryway, the marble floors gleamed. The air carried the faint scent of roses Vanessa always ordered for appearances. Jonathan stepped into the grand hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He set down his briefcase, removed his coat, and noticed how still the house was. It was not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of something unnatural, like air before a storm. Then he heard it, the weak, broken sobs of a child. His body froze, his ears straining. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Then came a voice, small, trembling, pleading, "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Jonathan's heart lurched violently in his chest. His daughter's voice, Grace. He moved down the hallway, each step heavy, his pulse hammering. He stopped just outside the living room doorway, his breath caught in his throat. The sight before him almost shattered him. Grace sat on the floor, her little body trembling, her torn pink dress dirty, her tangled curls falling across her tear-stained face. In her arms, she clutched Noah, who was red-faced from crying, his tiny fists clenched, his wails filling the room. Grace's arms wrapped around him desperately, like a shield. Standing over them was Vanessa. Her blonde curls were styled perfectly, her makeup pristine, her dress a vivid red that seemed almost violent in the soft glow of the chandelier. But her voice was sharp and venomous. "Shut up. How many times have I told you not to bother me? If you don't listen, I'll throw you both out on the street." Jonathan's fists clenched. Rage surged inside him, but for a moment he was rooted to the spot, unable to believe what he was seeing. His little girl begging for mercy, his baby crying helplessly, and the woman he had trusted to care for them standing as their tormentor. He could not stay still any longer. He stepped into the room, his voice cutting through the tension. "Stop." Vanessa spun around, startled. For a fraction of a second, her eyes flashed cold and venomous, but then the mask slipped back into place. Her lips curved into a soft smile, her tone dripping with sweetness. "Darling, you're home early. I was only disciplining them. You know how children are. They whine and fuss over nothing." Jonathan's eyes locked on Grace's face. She was frozen, her wide brown eyes filled with terror, her small fingers gripping Noah tightly. She did not move toward him. She did not even seem to trust that he could protect her. The distance between them, carved by months of absence, struck him like a blow. He wanted to scoop her into his arms, to take Noah and never let go, but his body trembled with hesitation. He had been gone so long. He had left them to face this alone. Vanessa moved closer, her manicured hand brushing his sleeve. "You must be tired, Jonathan. Don't get upset over childish fussing. Go and change. I'll prepare dinner. The children just need a firm hand sometimes, that's all." Jonathan's gaze dropped to Grace's wrists. Faint purple bruises marked her skin. His throat tightened. He looked at Noah, still sobbing, still clinging to his sister, as if she were his only protector. The house, once a symbol of his success, now looked like a prison where his children had suffered in silence. He felt guilt crash over him like a wave. His absence had created this nightmare. His grief had blinded him. And now, confronted with the truth, Jonathan realized that everything he thought he had done to protect his family was a lie. Success meant nothing if his children lived in fear. Vanessa, his second wife, stood tall in her red dress, lips curling into a falsely sweet smile, eyes glinting with hidden hostility. For months, Jonathan had believed she was the steady presence his children needed. She had been Angela's friend once, sitting at their dinner table, playing with Grace, offering comfort during Angela's illness. But tonight her mask cracked wide open. Jonathan's anger simmered, and he tried to gather his composure as Vanessa reached for his sleeve with a gesture rehearsed to look gentle. "Darling," she said, her tone smooth like honey dripping over glass shards, "the children have been restless. They needed correction. You know how little ones can exaggerate when they cry." Jonathan's gaze shifted from her perfect manicured nails to Grace's trembling body and Noah's desperate wails. Every instinct screamed that what he was seeing was no exaggeration. He had been absent, yes, but he was not blind. The bruises on Grace's wrist, the dirt staining her pink dress, the sheer terror in her eyes. These were not the marks of a child's tantrum. He bent down slowly, his arms extending toward Noah, but Grace recoiled, pulling her brother back. The rejection hit him harder than any insult. His daughter was afraid to come near him, afraid that even her father could not protect her. Jonathan's throat burned, his heart pounding with guilt. He whispered softly, "It's all right, Grace, Daddy's here." But the words sounded hollow even to him. He had not been there. He had been gone, drowning himself in paperwork while his children faced this torment. Vanessa quickly interjected, her voice rising with false authority. "Jonathan, don't encourage her dramatics. She does this often, tries to make me the villain whenever I discipline her. You know how children test boundaries. I've only been trying to keep order." Jonathan clenched his jaw, staring at the woman he once thought had saved his family. Her eyes, cold beneath the layer of mascara, betrayed the venom in her heart. He could not speak, not yet, because anger this sharp threatened to spill out uncontrollably. Instead, he stood and adjusted Noah in his arms. The infant sobbed loudly, but when Jonathan rocked him with hesitant, clumsy motions, the cry softened. Grace's eyes flickered briefly with something fragile, hope perhaps, but the fear quickly returned as Vanessa stepped closer, her voice still laced with sweetness. "You see? They just need patience, discipline, and a strong hand. You've been away, darling, so you haven't seen how wild they can be. Leave it to me. I'll handle them." Jonathan's eyes hardened. He sat Noah gently on his shoulder, his tiny hands gripping Jonathan's collar as if to cling to safety. He turned back toward Grace, bending low so he could look directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Grace," he whispered, "you're safe. Daddy's here." Grace blinked but said nothing, her lips pressed tight, her little body still coiled in fear. Vanessa stepped forward, her hand brushing Jonathan's arm again, her perfume filling the space between them. "Why don't you go upstairs, freshen up? I'll set the table. The children need to calm down. It's better if they don't see us upset, it confuses them." Jonathan's fists curled at his sides. The casual way she twisted everything enraged him, but he forced his voice steady. "Dinner," he said shortly. "Let's eat." He knew that if he exploded now, Grace would only be more terrified. He needed to see more, to understand the depths of what had been happening in his absence. Vanessa gave a satisfied smile, mistaking his calm for surrender. She gestured toward the dining room, her heels clicking against the marble as she led the way. Grace hesitated, eyes darting between her father and stepmother. Jonathan extended his free hand, his palm open, inviting. Slowly, trembling, Grace rose from the floor and stepped closer. She did not take his hand, but she walked beside him, her small frame close enough that he could feel the tension in her steps. In the dining room, the golden chandelier shone over a polished mahogany table already set for dinner. Silverware gleamed, crystal glasses sparkled, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. Everything appeared perfect, but perfection now seemed grotesque. Jonathan sat at the head of the table with Noah in a small chair beside him. Grace slid into a seat across, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed downward. Vanessa took her place on Jonathan's right, her smile plastered back into place. "Eat, sweetheart," she cooed to Grace, placing a piece of meat in her bowl. Her hand rested on Grace's shoulder, but the pressure was too firm, her smile too wide. Jonathan watched as Grace flinched, the spoon trembling in her hand. His eyes narrowed. The faint purple marks on her wrist told a story Vanessa's words never could. He turned sharply toward Grace, his voice calm but heavy. "Grace, has anyone at school been bothering you?" The girl startled, her eyes wide with fear. She shook her head quickly, her voice a whisper. "No, Daddy." Vanessa let out a soft laugh, smoothly covering. "Children bump into each other all the time. She's clumsy, that's all." Jonathan didn't respond. His hand twirled the spoon slowly, his jaw tight. He studied his daughter's every movement, every flicker of her eyes. She was terrified. She was hiding something, and he, her father, had been too blind to see until now. The meal dragged on painfully. Noah fussed, crying again. Vanessa stood, circling to pick him up, but her grip was sharp, careless, and the baby screamed louder. Jonathan's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, arms extended. "Give him to me," he said, his voice hoarse but urgent. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes flicking to his. Then she reluctantly handed Noah over. Jonathan rocked the child awkwardly, but within moments the crying softened, the little body relaxing against him. Grace's eyes lifted, just for a second, filled with both surprise and longing. For the first time in months, Jonathan felt the bond of fatherhood rekindling. He pressed a gentle kiss to Noah's head and whispered, "You're safe now. Daddy's here." But even as he whispered it, his own heart questioned how true those words were. Dinner continued in strained silence. Vanessa filled the air with empty chatter about Jonathan's business trips, new investments, and neighborhood gossip. But Jonathan barely heard her. His eyes never left Grace. Each time Vanessa touched her, each time she leaned in with that forced smile, Jonathan saw the little girl stiffen, saw her knuckles whiten around her spoon, saw her shoulders flinch. Mrs. Evans, the housekeeper, entered quietly to bring dessert. She said nothing, her eyes lowered, but Jonathan noticed the subtle way her glance lingered on Grace. There was something in that glance, something that spoke without words. Vanessa continued talking about trivial matters, recounting news of a neighbor's garden party, mentioning new investments Jonathan should consider, her voice rising and falling in practiced rhythm. But none of it mattered, because Jonathan's entire focus was on the children. He replayed the image of Grace flinching beneath her stepmother's hand, the faint bruises on her wrist, the way she seemed too afraid to speak, and the subtle moment when Mrs. Evans, the housekeeper, had met his eyes with unspoken concern. The food on his plate was untouched, and his chest ached with the weight of realization. He had been gone too long, too blind, too consumed by grief and work to notice that the perfect picture he thought he left behind was rotting in his absence. Vanessa leaned closer, pouring him a glass of wine, her perfume filling the air. "You've been working too hard, Jonathan," she said sweetly, placing the crystal glass in front of him. "The children miss you, of course, but I've been keeping everything in order. It hasn't been easy handling their moods, but I manage." Jonathan stared at the wine but didn't drink. His mind screamed at the word moods. Grace's eyes weren't the eyes of a child having moods. They were the eyes of a child living in fear. He caught Grace glancing quickly at him, then away, as if too afraid to hold his gaze. He gave her the faintest nod, but her shoulders stayed stiff, her body coiled with silent tension. When dessert was placed on the table, a bowl of pudding with a silver spoon, Grace hesitated, lifting it to her lips, then setting it down untouched. Vanessa's smile faltered for a split second before returning, but Jonathan had seen it, the flash of irritation, the subtle tightening of her jaw. He shifted his focus to Grace and asked gently, "Grace, do you like pudding? You used to love it when your mom made it." Grace's eyes flickered with pain, and she shook her head slightly, whispering, "I'm not hungry." Vanessa immediately chimed in, her laugh airy. "She's been picky lately, Jonathan. Always fussing, always resisting. I keep telling her she has to learn discipline. A mother's job is never done." Jonathan's jaw clenched at her words. Angela had never needed to use fear to discipline Grace. Angela had taught with patience, with warmth, and the girl had flourished under her touch. Now Grace sat silent, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Noah whimpered softly in his sleep, and Jonathan reached out to adjust the blanket around him, his hand trembling as he tucked it securely under the baby's chin. Every small sound from his children burned into his conscience, reminding him of how absent he had been. Vanessa continued her chatter, oblivious to his silence. "Tomorrow, I'll take Grace shopping for new clothes," she said with false cheer. "Her old ones don't fit anymore, and she insists on wearing the same ragged dress. You'd think she doesn't care about appearances." Jonathan's eyes dropped again to the tattered pink dress Grace wore, stained and torn, clearly not something chosen out of stubbornness, but out of neglect. His chest tightened as he realized she had been wearing it not by choice, but because she had not been given better. He inhaled slowly, carefully controlling his voice, and said, "We'll see about that. I'll handle her clothes." Vanessa blinked, surprised at his interruption, then quickly smiled again, adjusting her tone. "Of course, darling, whatever you prefer. I only wanted to help." Jonathan's hand tightened on the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. He could feel the performance in every word Vanessa spoke, the way she tried to bend the story in her favor, always making herself appear the devoted wife and stepmother. But behind the mask, Jonathan had seen the venom, had heard the threats, had noticed the bruises. He knew now that this woman was not the angel she pretended to be, but a predator hiding in plain sight. Grace's spoon clinked softly against the bowl, her small hands trembling, and Jonathan turned his gaze back to her, lowering his voice so it carried only to her. "Grace, are you tired?" She hesitated, then nodded quickly, still not meeting his eyes. Jonathan pushed his chair back and stood, lifting Noah gently into his arms. "Then let's get you both ready for bed," he said firmly. Vanessa's smile flickered, a shadow crossing her face before she recovered. "I'll take him upstairs," she offered, stepping forward, but Jonathan shook his head, his tone sharper than before. "I'll do it." For the first time, Vanessa's composure cracked. Her eyes flashed briefly with annoyance, but she quickly masked it with a shrug. "As you wish, darling." Jonathan turned to Grace and extended his free hand. She rose slowly, still reluctant, but this time she placed her small hand into his palm. The fragile warmth of her touch almost broke him. He guided her gently out of the dining room, Noah resting heavily against his shoulder, his tiny breaths uneven but steadying in his father's arms. Upstairs, Jonathan led Grace into her bedroom. The room was tidy but cold, the toys neatly arranged as if untouched for months. He set Noah in the crib and tucked the blanket around him, then knelt before Grace. "Do you feel safe here?" he asked softly. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly shook her head, pulling her sleeve down over her bruised wrist. Jonathan felt his throat close, his chest burning with the confirmation of what he already knew. His daughter had been living in fear, hiding her pain, silenced by threats. He wanted to press for more, to ask her who had hurt her, to demand every detail, but he held back, afraid of frightening her further. Instead, he whispered, "I'm here now. I'll protect you." Grace blinked, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She climbed into bed, curling into a ball, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Jonathan sat beside her until her breathing slowed, until her eyes closed from exhaustion. When he finally rose, his body felt heavy with the weight of truth. As he stepped into the hallway, he paused. Downstairs, he heard Vanessa's laughter, light and melodic, drifting up as she spoke on the phone. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound itself felt sinister now, a reminder that danger lived under his roof. Jonathan walked slowly toward his study, his mind already forming questions, already piecing together what he had seen. Tomorrow he would confront Mrs. Evans. Tomorrow he would dig deeper. Jonathan had tried to focus on the files stacked on his desk, contracts waiting for his signature, but the words blurred, meaningless in the face of what he had seen. For years, he had prided himself on controlling negotiations worth millions, on spotting deception in a handshake or a contract. Yet under his own roof deception had flourished, and he had been blind. He moved toward the staircase, drawn by the faint murmur of voices below. At first he thought Vanessa was still on the phone, her laughter carefully pitched to sound like the perfect hostess, even when no guests were present. But then he froze as he heard another sound, small and trembling, coming from his daughter. Jonathan pressed himself against the wall, his heart thundering in his chest, as he realized Vanessa's voice was not meant for him. She was speaking to Grace, her tone sharp as a blade slicing through silk. "Remember this," Vanessa hissed, her words laced with venom. "If you ever open your mouth to your father, if you dare tell him anything, I'll throw you and that little brother of yours out on the street. Do you hear me? Out on the street, where no one will want you." There was a pause, and then came Grace's voice, so small, so broken that Jonathan felt the sound pierce straight through him. "Please, please don't," she whispered. "I won't say anything. I'll stay quiet. I promise." Jonathan's hands clenched the banister, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His throat burned with words he wanted to shout, with the fury that surged inside him, but his body remained locked in place. He understood instinctively that if he stormed in now, if he let his rage explode, it might terrify Grace even more. He swallowed the fire inside him and forced himself to stay silent, listening as Vanessa's tone shifted once again, her venom hidden beneath a soft laugh. "Good girl," she crooned. "Now finish your food and I'll give you dessert." Jonathan stood there, paralyzed, his heart hammering with guilt and fury. For months, he had told himself that leaving the children with Vanessa was the right thing, that his business demanded his time, that his grief excused his distance. But tonight those excuses dissolved into nothing. He had left his children unprotected, had handed them over to a woman who threatened and tormented them while he signed contracts in glass towers. He thought of Angela, of her gentle hand on Grace's curls, of the way she had sung lullabies to the baby she never lived to raise, and his chest constricted with a grief sharper than any he had felt before. He heard the faint sound of a spoon clinking against a bowl, the soft sniffles of Grace trying to hold back tears, and he pressed his forehead against the cold wood of the wall, his body trembling with restraint. When at last he moved, it was with the heavy steps of a man carrying a vow. He returned to his study, closed the door softly behind him, and stood in silence by the bookshelf, his hand gripping the frame of a photograph of Angela. Her smile in the picture seemed to speak to him, her eyes reminding him of the promise he had once made but failed to keep. He whispered under his breath, "I'm sorry. I won't fail them again." The hours crept by as Jonathan remained awake, listening to every creak and whisper in the house. He thought he heard footsteps in the hallway once, soft and hesitant. But when he opened the door, there was no one there, only the faint echo of movement. He returned to his desk, but the papers remained untouched. He could not think of numbers or contracts, only of his children. When dawn broke, the pale light seeping through the curtains, Jonathan splashed cold water on his face, adjusted his collar, and walked straight to the kitchen. Mrs. Evans was there, her frail hands moving steadily as she placed dishes onto the wooden shelf. She froze when she saw him, her eyes dropping instantly to the cloth she held, as if afraid to speak. Jonathan's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "How were the children while I was away?" Mrs. Evans hesitated, her hands tightening around the cloth, her shoulders stiffening as though weighed down by a decision she had delayed for too long. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "I want the truth." She looked down at the floor, her voice low and halting, but each word landed like a hammer on Jonathan's heart. "Some nights, Miss Vanessa made the girls stand on the porch for hours just for dropping a spoon. One night, I found her in the storage room holding the baby because their bedroom door was locked. Many times Noah was given only watered-down milk. He cried from hunger until he fell asleep. I tried to help, but she told me I had no right to interfere." Jonathan's chest tightened with rage, his hand gripping the back of a chair to keep it from shaking. He forced his voice steady. "Did she make threats?" Mrs. Evans nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "She told the girl that if she ever told you the truth, both children would be thrown out on the street. She threatened to fire me too if I spoke of it. I am sorry, sir, but she is cunning, and I am only a servant here." Jonathan shook his head quickly. "No, it is not your fault. From now on, if anything happens, you tell me directly, and if it comes to it, will you testify?" The old woman raised her eyes at last, and in them was a quiet resolve. "For the children, I am willing." Jonathan's throat tightened, his chest filled with both gratitude and anguish. He knew now that he had enough truth to shatter the lies Vanessa hid behind, enough to begin protecting his children openly. That day he canceled every appointment, called his office with instructions to postpone meetings indefinitely, and moved through the rooms of the house like a man inspecting a crime scene. He opened the closet in the children's room, checked their blankets, examined the bottles, and scribbled notes in a tight press script. Each small trace was an accusation, each worn dress or watered-down bottle a silent testimony to his failure. Vanessa moved through the house with her usual grace, smiling, asking about his business trip, speaking sweetly about dinner plans. But Jonathan said little. He was watching her closely now, every gesture, every word, every shadow in her expression. That night, as he sat in his study, the photograph of Angela before him, he made a vow that burned in his chest like fire. He would protect his children no matter what it took. He would not let Vanessa's threats go unchallenged. And for the first time, he began to plan not as a businessman chasing profit, but as a father determined to fight for his family. The morning light slanted through the grand windows of the dining room, illuminating the polished silver and fine china that Vanessa always insisted on displaying even for ordinary meals. Grace sat quietly at the table, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, refusing to meet her father's gaze. Noah sat in his chair, restless but subdued, and Jonathan could not ignore how light his son's body felt whenever he held him, as though the baby had been fed less than what he needed. He caught himself staring too long at his children, and when Vanessa noticed, she smiled with her usual rehearsed sweetness, her words syrupy, but edged with a warning Jonathan could hear beneath the tone. "They're still adjusting, darling. You know how children are. They miss their mother, and they test the patience of everyone around them. I'm only doing what's necessary." Jonathan forced a smile, but said nothing. He was watching, recording every flicker of movement in his memory like evidence to be filed away. When Vanessa rose to take a phone call, stepping gracefully into the hallway with her voice pitched high enough for Jonathan to catch phrases about investments and social obligations, Jonathan turned his gaze to Mrs. Evans, who was clearing plates from the sideboard. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who had lived long in other people's houses, careful never to intrude, careful always to fade into the background. Yet Jonathan could see in the way her hands tightened around the porcelain that she carried truths she had not yet spoken. He waited until Vanessa's laughter echoed faintly from the far end of the hall, then rose from his chair, his voice low and steady. "Mrs. Evans," he said, "sit down a moment." The older woman froze, her eyes darting nervously toward the door, but Jonathan's expression brooked no refusal. She set down the dishes and sat stiffly at the edge of a chair, folding her hands together. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp with urgency. "You told me yesterday some of what has been happening, but I need everything. No half-truths, no hesitation. I can't protect my children unless I know." Mrs. Evans swallowed, her eyes glistening, and spoke in a halting rhythm. "There are things you don't know, sir. Things I hoped would stop on their own, but they only grew worse. Some nights, Miss Vanessa locked the children out of their room. I found them in the storage room, the girl holding the baby while he cried himself to sleep. I begged her to stop, but she said I had no right. She told me if I interfered again, I'd be dismissed immediately." Jonathan's fists clenched, but he forced his breathing steady. Mrs. Evans continued, her voice shaking. "The baby. Noah, she watered his milk down so much it barely had any taste. He cried for hours from hunger. Grace tried to soothe him, rocking him until she was too tired to stand, but Vanessa would sneer and say the girl was only pretending to be a mother. More than once, she made Grace stand outside on the porch in the cold night barefoot, because she said the child had disobeyed her. Grace stood there shivering for hours until I snuck out to wrap a blanket around her shoulders. I swear to you, sir, I tried to do what I could, but she threatened me too. She said if I told you, she would throw the children out on the street, and she would ruin me." Jonathan felt the weight of every word crush down on him, his jaw tightening until it ached. He whispered almost to himself, "And all this happened while I was gone." Mrs. Evans lowered her eyes, her voice soft. "Yes, sir. She is clever. She smiles when you are here, plays the part of the devoted wife. But the moment you leave, she changes. Her voice turns sharp, her hands cruel. She despises the children, and she makes no secret of it to them." Jonathan's throat tightened, his chest burning with guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. But he steadied himself, placing his hand flat on the table to anchor his resolve. "It is not your fault," he said firmly. "Do not carry that burden. This is mine. From now on, if she raises her hand, if she locks them out, if she even breathes a threat, you come to me directly, and I need you to swear something to me. If it comes to court, if this goes before a judge, will you testify?" Mrs. Evans's lips trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. But then she lifted her chin, and in that moment Jonathan saw not a servant, but a woman carrying her own quiet strength. "For those children, yes. I will testify. I will speak every truth I have seen." Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders dropping with both relief and sorrow. He reached across the table and placed his hand lightly over hers. "Thank you. I will not allow her to harm them again." That afternoon, Jonathan canceled every meeting with a single call to his secretary, his voice clipped and final. "Family emergency. I don't know when I'll be back." He turned his attention fully to his home, moving through each room with a sharp eye. He opened drawers, examined closets, checked the bottles, noted the thinness of the blankets on the children's beds, the wear of Grace's shoes, the way Noah's toys looked untouched, as though his cries had been ignored rather than soothed. Every observation etched itself into his memory like evidence to be presented. He knew now that this was not just a matter of discipline twisted into cruelty. It was systematic neglect, calculated malice, hidden behind the mask of refinement. Vanessa noticed his silence, of course. She asked about his trip, pressed him about new investments, even suggested an evening gathering with friends. But Jonathan gave her nothing. His responses clipped, his eyes always on the children. He had spent years mastering the art of hiding his thoughts from business rivals, and now he turned that skill against his own wife. He studied her every move, every subtle glance at Grace, every flicker of irritation when Noah whimpered. He saw the way she tightened her grip on a glass until her knuckles whitened when Grace accidentally dropped a fork. And he knew then that her patience was nothing more than a performance. That night, Jonathan sat in his study once again, but instead of contracts, he spread a notebook across the desk and began writing. Each line was precise, each detail recorded. The bruises, the threats, the testimony of Mrs. Evans, the fear in Grace's eyes, the malnutrition evident in Noah's frail body. He wrote not as a businessman preparing a deal, but as a father preparing for war. On the desk sat the photograph of Angela, her gentle smile a reminder of the promise he had once made and broken. He placed his hand on the frame and whispered, "I will not fail them again." Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, but Jonathan no longer felt paralyzed by grief. He felt focused, determined, awake in a way he had not been since Angela's death. He understood now that protecting his children meant more than comforting words or fleeting gestures. He knew now that her cruelty was not a moment of weakness or a lapse in judgment. It was calculated, consistent, and deliberate. He also knew from Mrs. Evans's testimony that Vanessa had grown bolder the longer he stayed away, and he suspected her motives went deeper than resentment toward his children. For years, Jonathan had amassed a fortune that most men only dreamed of, and Angela's death had left the Miller family trust in his name, with provisions written for his children's future. If Vanessa could somehow gain control of that trust, she would hold power over everything he had built. The thought sickened him, but he needed proof. The following afternoon, Jonathan pretended to take a call from his office, retreating to the back porch where he could observe without being seen. From behind the row of tall poplars that lined the garden, he saw Vanessa slip out of a side gate, her red dress catching the late sunlight. She moved with a quickness that betrayed urgency rather than leisure, her eyes darting across the yard before she stopped near the hedge. A moment later, a man entered through the gate, dressed in a dark coat with a thin leather bag slung over his shoulder. Jonathan's breath caught as he recognized the type, an attorney or financial agent, someone accustomed to discretion. He crouched lower, his body tense, listening as their voices carried faintly in the still air. "You're right on time," Vanessa said, her voice stripped of its usual honey, sharp and commanding. "Caleb, I can't wait much longer. The authorization has to be finalized." The man's tone was equally businesslike. "It's a large sum, Vanessa. I need more than your marriage certificate. The proxy signature for the family trust is still missing. Walker isn't a fool. If he looks too closely, this falls apart." Jonathan's stomach tightened at the sound of his own name spoken so casually in a scheme. Vanessa's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry. He's too busy playing the perfect father these days. He thinks reading bedtime stories and hovering around the children makes up for years of absence. I'll get what you need another way if I must. You'll have the paperwork within 2 weeks." Caleb nodded briskly, handing her a thin stack of papers from his bag. "No later. After that, scrutiny increases and moving assets will be impossible." Vanessa brushed his hand lightly as she accepted the documents, her voice dropping to a whisper Jonathan could barely catch. "Keep it quiet. If he suspects, everything is lost." Jonathan felt heat rise in his chest, a fire stoked by betrayal deeper than he had imagined. This was not only about cruelty toward his children, it was about greed, about theft, about stripping from Grace and Noah the inheritance Angela had wanted to protect. He gripped the tree trunk to steady himself, his mind already moving through the implications. If Vanessa succeeded, she could not only hurt his children emotionally, but also cut off their financial security. It was no longer a question of whether he would confront her. It was a matter of how and when. Caleb left quickly through the gate, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing into the street. Vanessa lingered for a moment, adjusting her hair, composing her face back into the soft expression she wore so well. Then she walked calmly into the house, as though she had spent the afternoon arranging flowers or reading a magazine. Jonathan remained where he was, his body trembling not with fear, but with cold fury. He understood now that Vanessa was not just cruel, but dangerous. She was capable of playing multiple roles at once, dotting honeyed words in front of him, spitting venom at Grace when he was gone, and scheming with strangers to seize what did not belong to her. He waited until the garden was empty before stepping back into the house. As he passed the living room, he caught sight of Grace sitting on the rug, stacking wooden blocks for Noah, who watched with wide eyes. When Grace glanced up at him, her gaze still carried the weight of caution, but there was also the faintest glimmer of hope, fragile and easily broken. Jonathan bent down, picked up a fallen block, and placed it in her hand. "You stay here with Daddy," he said softly. Grace gave the smallest nod, her lips parting as if she wanted to say more but didn't. Jonathan stood again, his hand brushing the inside of his jacket pocket where Angela's letter remained. Its words burned into his memory. "Trust your daughter's eyes. She will not lie when she is afraid." His daughter's eyes had told him everything. That evening, Jonathan sat at the dining table across from Vanessa, his expression unreadable. She smiled as though nothing had happened, speaking cheerfully about a charity gala, about a neighbor's new car, about trivialities that filled the silence. Jonathan answered in monosyllables, watching her carefully, hearing in his mind the words she had spoken in the garden about him being too busy playing the perfect father. When Noah cried, Vanessa reached for him, but Jonathan intercepted quickly, lifting his son into his arms, rocking him gently until the wails subsided. Vanessa's smile flickered, but she said nothing, sipping her wine as if it were all beneath her notice. After dinner, Jonathan retreated to his study and opened his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number of Richard Holmes, his longtime attorney, and the only man he trusted with both business and personal matters. Richard had guided him through acquisitions, protected him from lawsuits, and drafted the trust Angela had insisted upon for their children. If anyone could help now, it was him. Jonathan typed a short message and pressed send. "We need to talk. Tomorrow evening. Urgent." He set the phone down, exhaled slowly, and looked once more at the photograph of Angela. Her smile seemed almost alive in the lamplight, her presence a reminder of the vow he had renewed. He whispered, "You were right. She is dangerous, but I will stop her." Upstairs, Grace peeked into the study, her eyes red from holding back tears. She clutched Noah in her arms, rocking him gently. Jonathan rose immediately, taking the baby from her, feeling how frail he was, how uneven his breath came. He motioned for Grace to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair, her back stiff, her eyes flicking toward the door as though expecting Vanessa to appear. Jonathan poured her a cup of warm water, pressed it into her hands, and spoke softly. "Sit here where it's warm. No one will hurt you tonight." Grace sipped timidly, still silent, but her eyes lingered on him longer than before, as if testing whether his promise could be believed. Jonathan sat with them until Noah drifted into sleep and Grace's eyes closed at last from exhaustion. When he finally carried them to their beds, he tucked the blankets tightly around them and whispered into the quiet room, "You're safe. Daddy is here." But he knew safety would only be real if he acted. He needed more than suspicion. He needed her to reveal herself in a way that could not be denied. That evening, Jonathan invited Richard for dinner, telling Vanessa only that it was business. She responded with enthusiasm, seizing the chance to play the role of the perfect hostess. She arranged a white tablecloth, set out red roses in the center, and polished the silverware until it gleamed beneath the chandelier. Grace stood near the edge of the room holding Noah, watching with wary eyes as Vanessa busied herself. But Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on his daughter's shoulder and murmured, "Stay close to me tonight." Grace nodded faintly, her lips pressed together, her arms tightening protectively around her brother. When Richard arrived, Vanessa greeted him with grace and charm, her smile wide and welcoming, her hand extended with just the right firmness. "Such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Holmes," she said warmly. Jonathan speaks so highly of you. Please come in." Richard nodded politely, shaking Jonathan's hand before glancing toward the children. He offered Grace a small smile, and though she did not respond, her eyes flickered briefly with curiosity. Dinner began with soup, the air thick with Vanessa's carefully staged conversation. She asked Richard about his family, laughed lightly at his remarks, and even bent down to dab a trace of milk from Noah's lips, as if she were the most attentive mother. To anyone else, she might have appeared flawless, but Jonathan's eyes never left the subtleties. The way her hand pressed too firmly on Grace's shoulder, the way her nails dug into the girl's fragile skin under the table. Grace's face tensed, her spoon trembling in her hand, and Jonathan's chest burned with restrained anger. Richard filled the silence with talk of financial strategies, casually noting updates to the Miller family trust, and Jonathan caught Vanessa's quick glance at him, a flicker of unease quickly hidden by another dazzling smile. Jonathan signaled calmly, his hand steady on the table. "I need you to review the structure of the trust. Make sure it's secure." Vanessa interjected smoothly, her voice honeyed. "Mr. Holmes, you are always so thoughtful, always protecting the family's security. I appreciate that." But Jonathan saw the tightening around her eyes, the subtle twitch in her jaw that betrayed her irritation. Dinner continued, and when Richard turned his attention to ask the chef about the sauce, Jonathan saw Vanessa lean close to Grace, her lips barely moving, her words thin and sharp as blades. "Remember this," she whispered. "If you breathe a word, your brother will pay." Grace froze, her spoon clattering softly against the bowl, her eyes downcast as though retreating into herself. Jonathan's hand gripped his glass so tightly he nearly cracked it, but he forced himself to hold steady, memorizing every detail. The meal ended slowly, Vanessa pouring tea with a serene smile, offering to take the children upstairs. "Come, sweetheart," she said to Grace, brushing her hair as though she were affectionate. Grace hesitated, her eyes flicking toward her father. Jonathan gave a small nod. "Go on," he said softly. "I'll be up later." Reluctantly, Grace rose, carrying Noah, and followed Vanessa from the room. Richard set down his teacup, leaning back slightly, his gaze sharp. "You want me to review the trust," he said quietly, "but I think that's not the only reason I'm here." Jonathan met his friend's eyes and nodded. "Both," he admitted. "The trust and something else." Richard pulled a notebook from his briefcase, opening to a blank page. "Then tell me what you've seen." Jonathan recounted the past nights in clipped fragments, the cries from the hallway, the threat on the staircase, the bruises on Grace's wrist, the watered-down milk, and the words Vanessa had just hissed to his daughter. Richard listened without interruption, only nodding, his pen scratching across the page as he wrote key words. When Vanessa returned, her smile was intact, but her eyes darted briefly to Jonathan, searching for cracks in his composure. She asked if the men needed anything else, and Richard replied politely, "No, thank you." The tea was very good. After she left, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "My friend, I'm afraid your second wife is hiding much more than you realize, but I can help you uncover it." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Where do we begin?" Later that night, after Richard had departed with promises to draw up protective measures, Jonathan found himself once more in the living room facing Vanessa. She poured herself a glass of wine, her posture relaxed, her smile confident. "You surprised me, Jonathan," she said lightly. "Bringing your lawyer here without telling me. What exactly do you think you're doing?" Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. "Grace has a bruise." "Explain it." Vanessa tilted her head, feigning offense. "Are you accusing me? Children fall. They bruise themselves. Do you think I enjoy caring for Sarah's children all alone while you hide in your office towers?" Jonathan did not look away. Angela taught them with patience, not with bruises or locked doors. She never once threatened them. At the mention of Angela's name, Vanessa's face twisted for a brief second before she regained her composure. She leaned closer, her voice hardening. "Sarah was always perfect, wasn't she? Everyone adored her, and I was nothing but her shadow. You married me not out of love, but out of pity, or because she asked you before she died." Jonathan remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. Then he said slowly, "I married you because I thought the children needed a woman in the house. I was wrong, and tonight I corrected it." Vanessa laughed bitterly, slamming her glass down so hard it cracked. "Corrected? You think you can just throw me out? Do you think anyone will believe you? You were gone for months. Who fed the baby? Who kept the house? Me. They'll believe me." Jonathan's voice stayed even, his tone flat with finality. "I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know what you confessed with your own mouth." Vanessa's eyes flashed with hatred, her mask slipping fully for the first time. "I hate her," she spat. "And I hate those 2 children who carry her face. Every time I look at them, I see your victory over me. And I will never let them make me feel small again." Jonathan's chest tightened, but his eyes stayed cold. "From tonight, I stand with them. I will not let anyone hurt them. Not even you." Vanessa sneered, her lips curling into a smile devoid of warmth. "Then prepare yourself. Because if it's a fight you want, I'm ready." In the silence that followed, Jonathan felt both dread and clarity. The masks had finally fallen, and the battle lines inside his own home were drawn. There was no more space for hesitation. The moment had come to move from silence into action. By sunrise, he had already spoken with Richard Holmes, who instructed him on the next steps. "File immediately," Richard had said firmly. "We'll petition for emergency protection and custody. Bring every piece of evidence: the housekeeper's testimony, photographs of the bruises, your own written accounts. The longer you wait, the greater the risk." Jonathan agreed, his jaw tightening as he looked toward the hallway where Grace and Noah slept. He had failed to protect them before, but he would not fail now. That morning, he canceled all business for the foreseeable future and dedicated himself to preparation. He spent hours with Mrs. Evans in the kitchen, documenting her testimony in writing. She spoke of nights when Grace had been forced to stand barefoot in the cold, of a diluted milk fed to Noah, of Vanessa's constant threats. Her voice shook, but her words carried the gravity of truth, and Jonathan wrote every detail with precision. He took photographs of Grace's wrists, the faint bruises still visible, the marks of what could no longer be explained away as clumsiness. He gathered the letter Angela had written before her death, the one warning him to trust their daughter's eyes, and placed it carefully into a folder with the other evidence. By the afternoon, Richard had arranged for the petition to be filed in family court, and a hearing was scheduled within hours given the urgency of the accusations. Jonathan drove to the courthouse with Grace holding his hand tightly. Noah left in the care of a court-appointed babysitter. Grace sat silently in the back seat, clutching her worn teddy bear, her eyes wide and fearful. But Jonathan squeezed her hand and whispered, "I'm right here. I'll never leave you again." She said nothing but leaned closer, her small body pressed against his arm as though she drew strength from his presence. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper, dust, and weak coffee when they entered. Vanessa arrived with her own attorney, a man named Alan Pierce, dressed in a sharp blue suit, his expression smug as though he had already won. Vanessa herself wore light makeup and carried a tissue, her eyes glistening with the calculated sheen of false sorrow. She dabbed delicately at her cheek as though already a victim of cruel lies. Jonathan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to stay steady, his arm wrapped protectively around Grace as they walked into the courtroom. The clerk called the case, Walker petitioning for emergency protection for minors. Judge Eleanor Myers presided, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She surveyed the room with practiced calm, her gaze moving from Jonathan to Vanessa to the small figure of Grace. Richard stood and presented their case with clarity and precision. "Your Honor, we request an emergency protective order and temporary custody on the basis of emotional abuse and neglect," he said firmly. "We submit the housekeeper's sworn testimony, photographic evidence of injuries, and a contextual letter left by the children's late mother." Alan Pierce rose swiftly in rebuttal, his voice smooth, his tone condescending. "Your Honor, these accusations are speculation. My client is a devoted stepmother who has raised these children while Mr. Walker has been absent for months at a time. Discipline does not equal abuse. The photographs proved nothing more than the normal bumps and bruises of childhood. Vanessa dabbed her eyes again, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Your Honor, I did my best. I cared for them while he worked, while he stayed away. I never wanted to be their mother, but someone had to feed them, bathe them, and comfort them. And now he accuses me? It isn't fair." Judge Myers's gaze remained unreadable as she said, "Call the witness." Mrs. Evans stepped forward, her thin frame trembling, but her voice steady. She spoke of what she had seen. The nights Grace was forced to stand on the porch, the time she had found the children in the storage room because their bedroom door was locked, the watered-down milk, the repeated threats. Alan attempted to discredit her, pointing to her age, asking if she could have mistaken a voice in a dark hallway. But Mrs. Evans raised her chin, her eyes fierce. "I have worked in that house for 10 years. I do not mistake the voice of the woman who threatened those children." Richard then presented the photographs of Grace's bruises, time-stamped only days earlier, and placed Angela's letter into the judge's hands. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Myers read the words aloud. "If I am no longer here, please protect Emily and Michael. Do not place your trust too quickly in anyone. Believe in your child's eyes. She will not lie when she is afraid." Jonathan bowed his head, his throat tightening as the sound of Angela's words filled the courtroom. Grace squeezed his hand, her small fingers trembling. Judge Myers looked at Jonathan, then at Grace, her expression softening just slightly. "Can the child speak?" she asked. Richard turned to Jonathan with a questioning look. Jonathan bent down, his voice soft. "You don't have to if you're afraid. But if you want to, I'll be right here." Grace hesitated, her eyes fixed on the judge's chair, then on her father's open hand waiting for her. She took a deep breath and whispered, "I want to speak." She walked slowly to the witness stand, her small shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. The clerk asked her name and age, and she replied in a voice barely above a whisper, "Grace Miller, 6 years old." The judge leaned forward slightly, lowering her tone. "You only need to tell the truth." Grace gripped the edge of the chair tightly, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Her voice cracked but did not break. She said, "If I told my dad, she would throw me and my brother out on the street. But I don't want my little brother to grow up scared anymore. I don't want him to cry all the time." Silence fell over the courtroom, broken only by Jonathan's sharp breath as he covered his eyes with one hand, tears slipping through his fingers. Richard set down his pen, not writing another word. Alan tried to object, his voice rising. "Your Honor, children can be influenced." But Judge Myers raised her hand sharply. "That's enough." She turned back to Grace, her eyes soft. "Thank you, child. You may step down." Grace returned to her father's side, clutching her teddy bear, and Jonathan pulled her close, whispering, "I'm proud of you." The judge reviewed the evidence one final time, her voice steady as she spoke. Based on the testimony of the witness, photographic evidence of injuries, the contextual letter, and the threatening behavior directed toward a minor, this court issues an emergency protective order. Custody is hereby granted to the plaintiff, Jonathan Miller. The defendant, Vanessa Miller, is suspended from all visitation rights until a final ruling is made. Furthermore, the case is referred to the district attorney for investigation into possible child abuse and fraudulent conduct concerning the family trust. Vanessa's chair screeched loudly as she leapt to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "Liar!" she screamed, pointing at Grace. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed like vultures, microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing relentlessly. Richard shielded Jonathan and Grace with his arm, urging them through the throng. "Keep moving," he instructed in a low voice. "No comment. Get the children into the car." Jonathan nodded silently, tightening his grip on Grace's hand, bending slightly to shield her small frame. She pressed her teddy bear to her chest, her eyes wide with fear as she buried her face against his side. They slipped through the crowd and into the waiting car, Richard slamming the door shut behind them. As the vehicle pulled away, Jonathan exhaled a long, shuddering breath, his hand still trembling against his daughter's small back. Grace looked up at him, whispering so faintly he almost missed it. "Is it really over, Daddy?" He kissed the top of her curls, whispering back, "Yes, my love. You're safe now." But deep down, he knew safety was still fragile, because Vanessa was not a woman to accept defeat quietly. That night the house felt different. Officers from Child Protective Services patrolled the perimeter, their presence requested by Richard to ensure no immediate retaliation. But even with protection, Jonathan found himself listening for every creak and shadow. He put Grace and Noah to bed in his own room, their small beds pulled close together so they could sleep near him. Grace clutched his shirt as she drifted off, and Noah's soft breathing calmed the storm in Jonathan's chest. Yet he remained awake, sitting in a chair by the door, watching the hallway through the crack of light. Around midnight, his phone vibrated. It was Richard. "The DA's office has opened the file," his attorney said, his voice calm but firm. "They'll investigate both the abuse and the attempted fraud on the trust. Vanessa's been remanded for 24 hours on contempt, but after that she'll be out. Don't underestimate her. She'll come at you harder." Jonathan's eyes darkened as he stared at the dim outline of Angela's photograph on the bookshelf. "Let her try," he muttered. But even as he spoke the words, his stomach tightened with dread. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Grace padded into the kitchen barefoot, holding Noah by the hand. She smiled faintly when Jonathan served them warm oatmeal, the simple gesture, something she hadn't received in months. He watched her spoon small bites into her brother's mouth before eating herself, and he felt tears prick his eyes at the sight of such tenderness from a child who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Mrs. Evans wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Jonathan with quiet relief. "They're better already," she whispered. Jonathan nodded, but he didn't miss the way Grace still flinched at sudden sounds, or the way her eyes flicked to the door as if expecting Vanessa to stride in at any moment. He crouched beside her chair and said softly, "You never have to be afraid in this house again. I promise you." Grace nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't fully left. Later that afternoon, Jonathan stepped onto the porch to take a call from Richard. The investigation was moving faster than expected, and subpoenas had already been issued for financial records connected to Caleb, the man Vanessa had met in the garden. But as Jonathan listened, movement caught his eye at the far end of the street. A sleek black car sat idling near the corner, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Jonathan's body tensed. He ended the call and stood motionless, watching. The car remained for several minutes before pulling away slowly, disappearing around the bend. He didn't need confirmation. Vanessa had allies, and she was watching. That evening, Richard came by the house with additional documents. He spoke privately with Jonathan in the study, his tone clipped and serious. "We have enough to freeze the trust temporarily. Caleb's involvement shows intent to defraud, but Vanessa is volatile. Don't let her near the children until the court finalizes the order." Jonathan nodded, feeling both gratitude and exhaustion. He walked Richard to the door, and as they stepped into the hall, they found Grace standing near the staircase, clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide. She had overheard. "Is she coming back?" she asked in a trembling voice. Jonathan knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "She can't hurt you anymore," he said firmly. "Not now, not ever. Do you believe me?" Grace hesitated, then nodded slowly, pressing her forehead against his chest. Jonathan held her tightly, his arms wrapping around the fragile child who had once been too afraid even to take his hand. But even as he comforted her, he couldn't shake the memory of Vanessa's last words in the courtroom. "You'll pay for this." The following day, the news ran stories of the courtroom drama. Headlines painted Jonathan as the grieving husband turned protective father, Vanessa as the fallen stepmother accused of cruelty. Jonathan ignored the articles, focusing instead on keeping his children close. But Mrs. Evans showed him one that quoted an anonymous neighbor claiming Vanessa had been seen late at night arguing with a man near the property. The description fit Caleb. Jonathan felt a cold chill ripple through him. One evening, 2 nights after the hearing, as Jonathan tucked Grace and Noah into bed, he heard the sound of glass shattering from downstairs. He rushed to the kitchen and found a stone lying among shards of broken window, a piece of paper tied around it with twine. His hands shook as he unwrapped the note. In sharp, hurried handwriting it read, "You may have won in court, but this isn't over. You can't hide them forever." Jonathan's breath caught, fury and fear surging inside him. He immediately called the police, who took the stone and the note as evidence, promising to increase patrols. Grace had crept from the stairs, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. "Daddy, was it her?" Jonathan pulled her into his arms, stroking her curls. "No one will touch you. I swear it." But his mind was racing, the weight of the threat pressing down. Vanessa had been unmasked in the courtroom, her rights stripped, but she was not finished. Jonathan realized that protecting his children would not end with one ruling. It would take vigilance, strength, and relentless courage. That night he sat in the darkened living room, with Noah cradled against his chest and Grace curled beside him. He whispered a vow into the silence. "Angela, I failed you once, but never again. They will grow up safe, no matter what she tries." Jonathan did not sleep the night after the stone crashed through the window. He sat in the living room with Noah cradled against his chest and Grace curled at his side, the broken glass already swept away, but the fear lingering like smoke after a fire. He could hear the faint hum of police cars patrolling the street outside, their presence a necessary shield. Yet he knew that true safety could not come from officers alone. It had to come from his resolve, from the choices he made now, from the promise he would either honor or betray again. As dawn crept through the curtains, Jonathan laid Noah gently back into his crib and covered Grace with a blanket where she had fallen asleep against his shoulder. He rose quietly, went to the study, and pulled out the folder of evidence Richard had asked him to keep updated. He added the stone and the note, photographing each detail before sliding them into a plastic sleeve. Every action felt heavy, but each one built toward something greater: the protection of his children and the dismantling of the woman who had once hidden her venom behind a smile. Later that morning, Richard arrived with news from the district attorney's office. "The note escalates this," he said firmly, laying out fresh documents on the desk. "The DA is moving forward with charges of child endangerment, fraud, and harassment. Vanessa will be indicted formally within the week. But Jonathan, you need to prepare. She will fight. She will drag you through the mud if she can. Stay focused." Jonathan nodded grimly. "I don't care what she throws at me. I care only about Grace and Noah." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "And that's exactly why you'll win." That week passed in tense rhythm, the house constantly watched by patrol cars, Jonathan spending every waking moment near his children. He took Grace to school himself, walking her to the classroom door, kneeling to meet her eyes. At first she hesitated, still afraid, but gradually she began to walk inside with a steadier step. When she returned in the afternoons, she brought home drawings, bright colors of flowers, stick figures of her family, always with her father holding her hand. Jonathan pinned each one on the refrigerator, telling her, "You make this house brighter every day." With Noah, he spent long hours rocking him, feeding him properly, watching as the baby's body slowly filled with the weight it had been denied. The hollow cheeks softened, the cries eased, and for the first time Jonathan felt his son's trust anchoring in his arms. Yet even as these small signs of healing appeared, Jonathan knew the shadows had not disappeared. Vanessa's name surfaced in tabloids, painted alternately as a misunderstood stepmother or as a villain. But the court of public opinion mattered less to him than the courtroom that would soon decide her fate. On the day of the formal hearing, Jonathan dressed his children carefully, Grace in a clean blue dress, Noah in a soft sweater. He carried Angela's letter in his pocket, its edges worn, but its words as sharp as the first day he read them. "Believe in your child's eyes. She will not lie when she is afraid." In the courthouse, Vanessa appeared in chains, her eyes blazing with a hatred that no longer bothered with pretense. She glared at Jonathan, then at Grace, her lips curling as if to spit venom again, but the bailiffs held her back, her protests silenced by the weight of evidence piled against her. Mrs. Evans testified, once more unwavering. Richard presented financial records linking Caleb to Vanessa's fraudulent attempts on the trust. The DA presented the stone and the threatening note. Grace did not need to speak this time. Her words had already changed everything. Judge Myers listened carefully, her sharp gaze unrelenting, and when she delivered her ruling, the room felt as though it exhaled a long-held breath. Vanessa was found guilty of child endangerment, harassment, and attempted fraud. Custody was granted permanently to Jonathan. The family trust remained protected for Grace and Noah's future. Vanessa was led away, her screams echoing through the chamber. But this time Jonathan did not flinch. He only pulled Grace close, lifted Noah into his other arm, and walked out of the courthouse into the light. Life did not transform overnight, but it began to rebuild. Weeks passed into months, and the patrols eventually ceased. The broken window was repaired, but Jonathan left the stone and the note in a drawer in his study as a reminder of what he had fought against. He spent his days not in skyscrapers or boardrooms, but at home cooking breakfast, helping Grace with her schoolwork, playing on the floor with Noah. Slowly the fear ebbed from Grace's eyes, replaced by laughter that echoed through the halls where once only silence had reigned. One evening in spring, Jonathan sat in the backyard watching Grace guide Noah along the path through Angela's old garden. The tomato plants were thriving again, their vines stretching upward with promise. Grace bent to show her brother how to touch the stems gently, her laughter carrying in the warm air. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his heart swelling with both grief and gratitude. He whispered quietly, "Angela, I did it. I kept my promise. Our children are safe." Grace ran back to him then, her cheeks flushed with sun, Noah toddling behind her. She climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest, her voice muffled but sure. "Daddy, we're really a family again, aren't we?" Jonathan kissed her forehead, wrapping his arm around her as Noah clung to his leg. "Yes," he said firmly, "and we always will be." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, and in that moment Jonathan felt the weight of his failures lift. He was not perfect. He had been absent, blind, consumed by grief, but he had returned in time, had stood up, had chosen his children over everything else. That choice, repeated every day in small acts of love and vigilance, was the truest wealth he could ever give them. The past could not be undone, but the future could be protected. He understood now that justice was not only the gavel of a judge, but the daily act of listening, of seeing, of never ignoring the quiet signals of a child asking for help. Grace had once whispered, "Please don't hurt us anymore." The end. If this story moved you, I'd truly appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring you more stories like this one. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What did you feel about Jonathan's journey as a father, Grace's bravery in speaking out, and the way the truth finally came to light? Which moment hit you the hardest? The whispered plea for safety, the letter from Angela, or the courtroom scene where a child's voice turned the tide? And tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? Your comments mean a lot, and sharing your perspective helps these stories reach more people who may find strength in them.